Hello, and welcome to the show. I'm Nadia Jordana, and you are watching It's a Woman's World. Today on the show, we'll be discussing the important subject of women lifting other women, both in life and in the corporate workplace, how they do it, how they sometimes don't do it and work against each other. Our guest today will be Tiffany Grandchamp, CEO of Women Lifting Women org. So she will be able to shed some very important light on this subject. Let's not hang around here any longer. Let's meet Tiffany. Welcome to the show, Tiffany.
Thank you for having me.
I'm so excited to have you here. You and I have talked on and off over the last couple of years, but it's really good to have a chance to have you on the program. And especially since today we're talking about the subject of women lifting other women and how that works in especially in the corporate workplace, but actually in a lot of different situations, and sometimes how it doesn't. And what I want first to hear about is your background and a little bit about your business or businesses. Go right ahead.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, this is one of my favorite topics. Such a favorite of mine that I started a business to help lift other women. A little bit about me, Nadia, and I'll keep it brief because there's a lot of diversity in the background for me and my professional experience. But I like to say that I grew up in healthcare. I started as a senior in high school, and I just kind of worked in all different aspects of it, washing dishes, working in the emergency department. I became a surgical assistant and then eventually got into the corporate side of healthcare. And that's when I started to see a lot of the divide between opportunities, behaviors, pay, just some equity issues between men and women. And so about 8 or 9 years ago, I left the corporate world and I started working in nonprofit. And I spent a few years in that space. I really enjoyed it. And at the time, I was going back to school to get additional degrees focused on organizational industrial psychology. And I really wanted to understand what makes a company tick, what makes them develop these policies, or what can equip them to help change policies to provide more equity in the workplace. So once I finished with those degrees, I started to put them into practice, and I started a business on the side while I was still working full time. And that's the company called Women Lifting Women. I started that kind of around the same time a lot of women started companies during the height of COVID, really looking for meaning in what I was doing and where my energy was focused. And in June of 2021, I left my really secure job and said, I'm going to go after this full time. I'm going to do nothing but this work. And so I have been working on Women Lifting Women exclusively since then, and things have continued to grow. I now have a secondary consulting company as well. So it's a little bit about what I'm doing in a very brief nutshell.
Oh, that's great. Well, let's kind of talk about some of the things that happen to women in the workplace, and what kind of things have you observed that happen in the workplace, and situations where it's gone well and women have helped each other, and of course sometimes when it doesn't.
Yeah, so I think one of the things that was really pervasive in a lot of different environments I worked in, and I will share, this is something I've seen. I've lived on the East Coast, I've lived in the South, I've now settled into the Midwest for, over a decade. And one of the things that was most pervasive is this power dynamic, right? It's a very inequitable power dynamic between men and women in the workplace. And depending on where you're at, I had the opportunity to be more vocal when I was on the East Coast. There are certain cultural elements to it depending where you are geographically, where I feel like there's a little bit more opportunity to speak up about it. There's other places where they just accept it. But regardless of where I was at, it always existed, this power dynamic where it's implied in that corporate setting that there is a lower level of power amongst women than men. And I couldn't wrap my head around it. When I started going back to school and I started to dig into the history of the evolution of this organizational industry, I apologize. When the Industrial Revolution occurred, right, women were less than 40% in the workforce, right? So you're building this whole industry and this infrastructure of it with less of a mindset toward women, right? And so this is just kind of this pervasive mindset is around men in the workforce and this environment tailored toward men. And so while we've definitely evolved since then, the mentality is just taking a really long time to catch up. And what's ironic about it is women in the workforce now still have these duties, these domestic duties at home, like that mind shift hasn't happened. And so you see that women are in the workforce doing double the work between the home and their work, but the mentality is that there's a different power dynamic with them. Typically the pay is less. And so I started to recognize that and experience it myself. And that's kind of when this aha moment happened for me that I really wanted to do something about it, is when I was in that seat and I was working side by side with men with the same credentials, the same experience, and I knew that I was getting paid probably anywhere between 20 to 40,000 a year less than them. It was really challenging for me to show up and feel like I was going to give the same level of energy and work to the organization with that knowledge.
Did you feel like you had any support from the other women around you, or were you more of a trailblazer in that respect?
I think it depended on the organization that I was at. There was one organization I worked at that I definitely had support. I had a mentor, and to this day, she will say she wasn't my mentor, but she really was. I'm always a trailblazer. I'm always an advocate. I'm that loud voice in the room, but she was the one that would take me aside and say, you know what, this isn't a time or a place to be loud. This is the time for you to sit back and observe and listen. And she was absolutely right. And I think those types of women that can still be champions to other women, but also be looking out for them to say, hey, I support you, but this is a space where you can learn more by listening. Or the women that get a seat at the table and they don't fight another woman for another seat. They actually like create space and bring a chair and say, here, come with me. So I've definitely experienced that. And other organizations, I've experienced the opposite. I recognize the fact that there are limited seats at the table. And so there are situations where women have arrived at the table and they worked so hard to get there that it's kind of coveted to them. And so I have had, a woman that has physically gotten in my face and in a corporate setting and said, everything is political. You're going to have to fight for this, which isn't my style. Even though I'm loud and I advocate, I'm a trailblazer. I don't think that women should be fighting against each other. And unfortunately, it's typically an environmental cause that creates that. But
I think you're right. That is not the style of a lot of women.
correct.
That doesn't make them weak. It's just not in their nature to approach things that way. And you and I were chatting before the show about the benefits of having a few gray hairs. And I was sharing with you, and I'll share it right now too, my story from way back. It was about 2 decades ago. And I had it a little bit better than some women in the corporate workplace because I was in sales rather than, as I mentioned, at the front desk, which is, I think, really typically a position that gets no respect. They do everything, completely run everything. They know everything, but doesn't get a lot of respect. But I was in sales, so therefore, both pay-wise and really in some ways there was a little bit more respect from the men, because you could compare notes. You did this today, I did this today, we're not that far off. But in meetings and in a lot of other situations, as I started out in my 30s, I really didn't have a voice, and I could tell that men and even other women who had gotten higher up on the ladder looked right through me, did not see me as a real player there at the table. And I used to just wait to get more gray hair, because I wanted to get over, for sure, I really wanted to be over 40. And that makes a difference, or at least at that time made a difference. And I think it's too bad that a person has to wait for age maturity to get a little bit of respect, when the youth of today have such incredible educations and knowledge and talent to share. Why put that off for 20 years? You're wasting it. And I think the thing that I noticed at that time was there was one woman in the corporation, and she had the second in command high position, but there was no helping of the younger women down the line. In fact, there was an awful lot of intimidating. I was scared to death of her. I was terrified of her. But so what are some of your comments about ways that women in power like that can help younger women?
I think women in power have an obligation to help other women. I feel very strongly that if you have been able to get there, because the reality is it is still a fight to get there, then you have an obligation to turn around and put your arm out and pull someone else up. I was the COO/CFO of a nonprofit a few years ago, and one of the first things I did was build a leadership development program. And I gave it to the organization for free in exchange for owning the IP to it, because I'm not unintelligent, right? And we went through a couple of years of that curriculum where every leader in the organization was able to go through this leadership development program. And that meant that, there wasn't a big training budget when I first developed that. So that was kind of the goal, is to bring leadership development training. But then I noticed, I made myself available as a coach in between the sessions, and I noticed the majority of the people coming forward and actually accessing that offer were women. And so I got to meet a lot of the women in the organization that way, because typically, to your point, they felt intimidated by the title and the position. They wouldn't just walk in my door, but now they had a reason to do that. And who I am as a person is not about a title or a position. I loved that part and that time during my role where I got to meet a lot of other women. That was one of the catalysts to me really launching the company faster, is I knew that was my calling and that's what I wanted to do. But I wanted to touch on the gray hair thing for a moment. Back when I was really young, in my early 20s, I was a surgical assistant. And I remember going into some of the cases with this huge amount of curiosity. And I would ask the surgeons, well, what about this? And what about this? And for years, I never knew what it meant, but there were seasoned assistants in there, women with their gray hair who had been doing the work for decades. And they would giggle and say, this must be a tweener day. And I never knew what it meant until years later, but they were talking about me and they were laughing because I was so young. And because I was asking so many questions, I clearly didn't know my job. And I just remember feeling uncomfortable in that environment, but not knowing why until years later. And then I'm like, oh, I was the tweener.
You were the tweener, and that's instead of encouraging you to ask questions, grow and learn, and lording it over you. Yeah, that kind of thing happens. And I think even in family situations, big sisters and younger sisters, that can go both directions. You're, I think, really blessed. I always would have liked to have had a big sister or even a big brother, but someone older in a mentor-like sibling position. In fact, even in the corporate workplace, having someone like that would have been really wonderful. So I think women are doing that more. I find it coming out more
Yes.
in writers groups that I'm in. I find them doing that with other women. Do you see that?
Yes, I do. One of the things that I actually teach is a whole module on mentorship. And that's probably one of the favorites because it is a very intimate relationship when you have a mentor because you have to have a lot of trust in them. And you also have to be open and vulnerable if you are willing to um, kind of share that piece about you that you want to grow and then find the right fit. So one of the things that I do is to help establish like this mentorship checklist that really identifies the attributes of a good mentor, but also the attributes of a mentorship, because there is reciprocity in mentoring, right? If you're willing to mentor somebody, you're going to get something out of it too. So the first step that usually happens is you go and identify someone based on whether or not they fit those criteria. And then you have a conversation that says, what do you think you'll get out of mentoring me? And so that open conversation really solidifies a good mentorship relationship. A lot of people, especially younger people, are thriving for a mentor because they're smart and they know that if they're going to get ahead, they're going to need somebody that they can connect with and that will help them.
Do you think that when in the situations when a person is put down in the workplace, is that a form of bullying? Does that fall into that category, or is that just a little bit off from that?
I mean, I think by today's definition it is. I think when that happened, 20 years ago, I didn't recognize that that was. And I think that the derivative of that was because, again, women cling to these positions and these places they fought to get to. I'm not justifying it because today still, I don't think it's right. But 20 years ago, I didn't identify that it was bullying. I just thought, well, this doesn't feel right. But by today's definition, I definitely do think it is. I think that it creates, there's different ways you can take it. You can continue to sit quiet and accept the status quo and be subject to it and then turn into something you don't want to be, which could be a bully or treating the people that have no control over your situation really poorly, taking it out on them. Or you can change what's happening to you. You can learn skills, you can become your own advocate, you can speak up to change the system. Men play a huge role in doing this to support women, and then become something very different.
I think you're absolutely right on that. And it comes out of fear. That's where it comes out of. I would think for, well, men and women, but for women corporations that are training their women to move up the ladder and take positions of leadership. Confidence training is probably a important thing to include, because the more confident a leader is, the less they're going to behave like that, and the more they're going to be willing to help reach down and bring others up behind them.
Yeah, I think the vocabulary is incredibly important too, because a lot of people feign confidence, right, as a way to survive. And that perpetuates this imposter syndrome that people have been talking about. And I wrote an article a few years ago called Imposter Syndrome as a Symptom of Organizational, or as an Organizational Hazard, where you have so many people saying imposter syndrome is this personal defect and that you have to focus on all the things that are wrong with you that's caused this, when in fact an organization can create imposter syndrome in women by them feeling like they have to be confident when they're not, right? So one of the things I offer to women is helping them craft their own personal value proposition. And by them having the ability to say, this is my value, this is how I can bring it to you. And also during that session, we talk about what brings you value in an organization so you can align. That is helping them to build real, genuine confidence in themselves. So they don't have to fake it until they make it, per se, and have this fake confidence that can start this cyclical process of imposter syndrome. So I agree with you, Nadia. I think confidence is very helpful in helping women to fight off this fear, and it also helps them to, in turn, lift up other women. But how they get that confidence is really important, especially in the corporate setting.
Absolutely. And I really am an example of someone who spent a whole lot of years using the imposter syndrome. And it wasn't called that at that time. It was fake it until you make it. And it worked for me. It at least
Yeah.
me in the game and got me there. But I definitely had those feelings of, that's not really who I am. What am I doing sitting here at this table? But I kept going until I felt the part. But I think there is a much straighter path towards that, and probably a much mentally and emotionally healthier way to get there. So I really appreciate you being on the show today, Tiffany.
Thank you. Yeah, I think one other thing is, when people say I'm going to define my value, they usually are very resound in what their value is, and they don't list the things that maybe they're not capable of but want to grow in. And so another thing that's important for women is to say, yes, definitely show up and share what your value is, but also share where you would like to develop and grow, and see if the culture that you are working in is open to you having a safe place to fail, right? Because the only way that you're going to develop and grow is to try and fail. And if you can fail safely somewhere, you're in the right environment too. You don't have to fake it until you make it. You can try and fail and try again. So I think those are the two important pieces, is to know the value that you bring to a place and know that you can try and fail safely.
I am so glad you said that. That is a really important point. Two things that you said that absolutely everyone should take away from this. Show up regardless. Show up. Be there. Show up. But don't be afraid of failing. Show up and don't be afraid to fail, and keep coming back. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Tiffany.
You're welcome.
Hello and welcome to It's a Woman's World. As you know, we always bring you the latest trends and conversation of things that are going on with women in community. Well, today we are talking about the importance of women lifting women. Let's have our panel discussion and let's dig deep. And I truly believe that Nadia Jordana has some great insight and some things that she wants to talk to us about. Welcome, Nadia.
I'm delighted to be here. And yes, this is a subject that's really important. I'm glad we're doing this today.
I am as well. And of course, we have Melissa Namango. How are you?
I'm doing good. And I just love the subjects we're going to tackle today.
That's right. That's right. Because you lift up women. That's what you do.
Yes, that's my job.
All right. And Candy Pettiford, so honored to have you here.
Yes, we are going to be lifting up women today and have great conversation. Something I think that people will learn. We women will learn from this. So let's get with it.
Let's get with it. And of course, I am your host, Jamela Pettiford. And as my mother always says, behind every good woman is the women who came before her. Let's begin this great discussion. Nadia, now you said that you kind of wanted to start off with mothers and daughters. Let's go there.
Yes, I think when we talk about women lifting up other women, one of the perfect places it can begin is in the home with mothers and daughters. And I know that can be a highly charged, potentially negative, usually positive kind of situation, but mothers are positioned in such a wonderful way to be able to teach and lift up their daughters and even nieces and other young girls in the family. And as they get older, and I'm going to want to hear from you too, your opinions, as they get older, there's a role for, like me right now, for grandmothers in the family. It's a little less disciplinary type of situation, more pal buddy, but those children need that too. And grandmothers can have a really joyful way of helping these young ladies become young women.
Yes.
Yes.
Well said.
It just brought to mind for me how the roles also are reversed when women have to deal with new concepts, new innovation, changes, and the daughters are now the ones who are more knowledgeable in those new ways. And they, in turn, would support their mother to bring her into the new way of doing things or looking at things. That happens a lot with our immigrant community out here in Minnesota, where the daughters are the ones who understand the laws, who understand the latest innovations in technology, the laws about domestic violence and what is acceptable, not in violence. Nothing is acceptable in violence. But they understand that those traditional views we kind of perpetuate in our societies are really not acceptable at all. And they help make their mothers understand and be more comfortable with standing for their peace. So it's a two-way street that I think works wonderfully across generations.